Hi. I want to talk about the first later charge that Socrates is guilty of corrupting the young, and I want to get to it kind of fast, get into it. I want to try to keep this around 15 minutes, and my videos run long, so let me try to do this. So Socrates, on the bottom, page 28, is accused of being guilty of corrupting the young. What he says to Miletus right after that, he says to Miletus at the bottom, page 28, Socrates says, he meaning Miletus, he says that I am guilty of corrupting the young. But I say that Miletus is guilty of dealing frivolously with serious matters, of irresponsibly bringing people into court, and of professing to be seriously concerned with things about none of which he has ever cared. And I shall try to prove that this is so. What Socrates is actually going to argue against Miletus in this first passage, as he says, getting into it, is that he's going to actually show that Miletus is not even concerned with the truth or the falseness of Socrates corrupting the young. What Miletus is going to do is what we would call today, Miletus is just going to try to trash Socrates. He's just going to try to get him convicted on any charges he can think of. And so what Socrates is actually going to try to do is to show that Miletus does not even understand the charges that he's accusing Socrates of, that Miletus just doesn't understand them. How does Socrates show that Miletus doesn't understand the charges? Socrates shows Miletus doesn't even has no idea how to explain these charges, and so what Socrates is doing in this, as he says in this piece, he says, "I say that Miletus is guilty of dealing frivolously with serious matters, of irresponsibly bringing people into court, and of professing to be seriously concerned with things about none of which he has ever cared." What Socrates is actually doing is he's going to show that Miletus is a silly person. He just doesn't care, and so Socrates is really trying to do that. He's frivolous. He doesn't care about these charges, and so he can't be guilty of them. So what Socrates does when he asks the question on the top of page 29, he says, "Come here and tell me, Miletus, surely you consider it of the greatest importance that our young men be as good as possible." Miletus says, "Indeed I do." And then Socrates says, "Come then, tell these men who improves them. You obviously know, in view of your concern. You say you have discovered the one who corrupts them, namely me, and you bring me here and accuse me to these men. Come, inform these men, and tell them who it is who improves them." What Socrates does is very clever. Miletus is accusing Socrates of being guilty of corrupting the young. Socrates turns that upside down and says, "Miletus, if you say that I'm guilty of corrupting the young, then you must know who benefits the young, who improves the young. So, tell us who improves the young." Why does Socrates do this? Why does he turn this upside down? Miletus accuses him of being guilty of corrupting the young. Socrates asks Miletus who benefits the young. He does that. Socrates does this because Socrates is going to show that Miletus doesn't understand the charge. And the idea is that if you know that someone corrupts someone, you must also know what benefits them. Why must you know that? Why do you have to know that someone benefits the young if you're accusing someone of corrupting them? Because you're using a standard to evaluate what you see. And it's the same standard. In other words, if I have a standard for my behavior, then when I fulfill that standard, I'm succeeding, I'm benefiting. When I fail at that standard, I'm harming, I'm corrupting. But it's the same standard that I'm using. In other words, to fulfill the standard and to fail at the standard it's the same standard. So you've got to know what the standard is in order to make any evaluation at all. When Miletus, Socrates is saying, when Miletus accuses Socrates of corrupting the young, Socrates is saying to Miletus, well, you must have a standard of what corruption is, of when this standard, when someone fails to achieve this standard. And if you have a standard that you use to say that someone fails at it, it must be the same standard that you're using when someone succeeds at it. So when Socrates says, who benefits the young, who improves the young, he's saying that Miletus is confused and doesn't have any standard. He's just throwing charges out there at Socrates that as Socrates says at the bottom of page 28, Miletus has given no thought to this at all. He's not concerned with any of this. He's frivolous and not serious and silly. Why? Because if Miletus was serious, he would understand the single standard that allows Miletus not only to accuse people of corrupting that standard, but of people improving the young with the same standard. Instead, Miletus doesn't know, and Socrates' point is to show that the jury that Miletus doesn't have a standard of behavior. He's just making up stuff. And how do we know that Miletus doesn't have a standard? Well, he's confused. And when Socrates says, you say you have discovered the one who corrupts them, namely me, and you bring me here and accuse me to these men. Come, inform these men and tell them who it is who improves them. You see, Miletus, that you are silent and know not what to say. Apparently, Miletus couldn't answer the question, who improves these young men? He just was silent. He stood there and couldn't say anything. Why couldn't Miletus say anything? Because he didn't really understand the charge. He didn't have a standard he was using to accuse Socrates of corrupting the young. Because if Miletus had a standard of who corrupts the young, that same standard would be what Miletus would use to say that someone benefits the young. Instead, Miletus can't say anything. He doesn't know who benefits the young because he can't explain how it is that who would benefit the young. So right off the bat, Socrates shows that Miletus doesn't understand these charges. He's not concerned. Miletus is only concerned with accusing Socrates and having the court find him guilty. And so they go through this conversation where eventually Socrates leads Miletus to say, who benefits the young? The jurymen benefit the young. The counselor benefits the young. The counselors benefit the young. The audience benefits the young. So that Socrates, at the end of this, is able to say, Miletus, you say that everyone in Athens benefits me. I alone corrupt them. Socrates, I accuse you of corrupting the young. Who benefits the young? Miletus eventually is led to say, everybody benefits the young. And so the original charge is that Socrates corrupts the young. The refocused charge in this piece that Socrates leads Miletus through on page 29, the refocused charge is that only Socrates corrupts the young. Now, what Socrates does then is throw this horse analogy at Miletus. And in the horse analogy, Socrates says at the bottom of page 29, he says, tell me, does this also apply to horses, do you think? That all men improve them and one individual corrupts them? Because Miletus has just said that all Athenians improve the young except Socrates. So Socrates says is this what you think, that all men improve them, the young, and one individual corrupts them? Or is quite the contrary true? One individual is able to improve them, or very few, namely the horse breeders, whereas the majority, if they have horses and use them, corrupt them. Is that not the case, Miletus, both with horses and all other animals? So the horse analogy is intended to show that most people, when they deal with horses, not really, and most people don't understand horses, so most people, when they deal with horses, harm them, or at least they don't improve them. Maybe they're neutral in this. But the horse analogy shows most people harm horses. Most people don't benefit horses. And so then Socrates says on page 29, going to 30, is that not the case, Miletus, both with horses and all other animals? Of course it is, whether you and Anytus, another accuser of Socrates, say so or not. It would be a very happy state of affairs if only one person corrupted our youth while the others improved them. So the refocused charge is that only Socrates corrupts the young. What Socrates shows in the horse analogy is that, like with horses, and most people harm or don't benefit horses, like with horses, most people don't benefit the young. If anything, they harm the young, because we don't understand young people like we don't understand horses. Most people are not experts in young people, just like most people are not experts or farmers or horse breeders who benefit horses. So experts in horses would benefit horses, but most people are not experts in horses, so they harm them or at least don't benefit them. So what Socrates' point is then is to show that Miletus's refocused charge that only Socrates corrupts the young contradicts the idea that most people harm horses, or at least most people don't benefit horses. So how could it be that only Socrates corrupts the young, where most people corrupt horses or don't benefit them when they're dealing with horses? Socrates is trying to show that Miletus contradicts this idea that that only Socrates corrupts the young. That can't be true. Now, how do we know this piece? And that's one of the questions that I ask here. What is Socrates' point about the horse analogy? And this is really the question in number 2, that extra credit point. How do we know that Socrates' point about horses is true, that most people don't benefit horses? If anything, they harm them. I mean, how do we know that? I'm not an expert on horses, but I have a pretty good suspicion that Socrates must be correct when he says most people don't benefit horses. How do we know that? We know it because of common sense. Common sense tells us that most people who don't understand things like horses and young people actually end up not benefiting them and maybe harming them. So that is common sense that tells us that. And so what Socrates is showing about Miletus is not that Miletus, when Miletus accuses Socrates of being the only person in Athens who corrupts the young, it's not that Miletus is contradicting himself, like Euthyphro contradicted himself constantly, and Socrates showed that. Socrates is showing not that Miletus contradicted something else that Miletus has said, but Miletus is contradicting common sense. And one of the interesting points here is that most of us, when we argue, what we try to show in the arguments of other people is that they contradict common sense. Common sense is what we gather generally about the world. We just know from what we do that, unless you're an expert, you don't understand, and you understand something. If you're an expert, most of us don't understand things, so we break things or we harm them. So when I try to fix my plumbing, my sink, which I did this past summer, I it took me hours and hours and days because I'm not a plumber. I'm not an expert in it. I harmed it several times before I finally figured out what was going wrong. It took me a long time. Why is that? Most people would be in my situation because we're not experts in fixing our plumbing. So what Socrates is showing is that most people, like when people deal with horses, most people don't benefit them, they harm them. And so when Meletus, Socrates is saying, when Meletus accuses Socrates of being the only person who corrupts the young, Socrates shows that Meletus is contradicting the common sense notion that most of us probably don't benefit the young, and probably a good number of us corrupt the young. So Socrates, in his defense here, says, why am I, essentially he's saying, why am I the only person accused of corrupting the young? When, as my argument about horses and my argument about plumbing, why is it that Socrates is the only person who's accused of being guilty of corrupting the young? Why? It's because Meletus is just throwing charges at Socrates. Meletus doesn't understand these charges. Meletus, as Socrates says on page 28, Socrates says, I say that Meletus is guilty of dealing frivolously with serious matters, of irresponsibly bringing people into court, and of professing to be seriously concerned with things about none of which he has ever cared. So Socrates accuses Meletus of being a silly fool. I mean, and I mean, silly here is a nasty thing. He's a clown. And so on page 30, after Socrates is done with this very short argument on page 29, on page 30, Socrates says to the jury and Meletus, he says, you have made it sufficiently obvious, Meletus, that you have never had any concern for our youth. You show your indifference clearly, that you have given no thought to the subjects about which you bring me to trial. Why is Socrates able to say that? Why is Socrates able to say that Meletus has given no thought to the young, that Meletus is not concerned with the young people at all, even though Meletus has accused Socrates of being guilty of corrupting the young? Why can Socrates say he's not concerned? Because he doesn't understand the charge. He's just throwing stuff out there. He doesn't answer a simple question. Meletus, you say I'm guilty of corrupting the young. I ask you then, if you say that I'm guilty of corrupting the young, you must have a standard that you're using to say that I'm guilty of corrupting the young. That standard is also used to tell us, to determine who benefits the young. So Meletus, who benefits the young? Meletus doesn't have a clue, because he's paid no attention to the standard. He's paid no attention to the young. He's only concerned, Meletus, with accusing Socrates and getting Socrates out of the way. And so Socrates shows that Meletus is just a silly, goofy, unserious, clownish person, and that the jurors and nobody else should take him seriously. Now, why do we go into this? Why did I go into so much detail about this? I mean, it's a single charge. We could have spent a lot more time on other things, I suppose, and in previous years, at various times, I have spent more time on other things. But this is an important piece because it shows Socrates' method. As we saw in the Euthyphro, Socrates has this method of refutation, and he uses it to devastating purpose against Euthyphro. Socrates shows that Euthyphro doesn't understand what piety is, and yet Euthyphro accuses his father of a capital crime, a crime punishable by death. Euthyphro, not understanding what piety is, accuses his own father of impiety, a charge that could result in his father's death. So it is a serious charge, a serious idea, when people don't understand what they're saying, when they don't understand the things that they claim to know. Socrates' claim is that the unexamined life is not a worthwhile life for human beings. Socrates' claim is that we must know what we don't know. Meletus is in terrible shape here. He clearly doesn't know what he's accusing Socrates of. And so we spend time on this, and I know it seems like a lot of detail going into this argument because it is Socrates' main commitment. Socrates wants to understand the world, and in order to understand the world and know that you understand the world, you have to sift through your beliefs to find what belief will hold or stand with some other belief. Ultimately, what Socrates is saying is that our lives are moral investigations. We have to investigate ourselves. And to do that, we investigate others. And when we investigate others, they challenge us with their beliefs. We see what's consistent, what's contradictory, and hopefully, once we know what's not true, we can then move on to what's true or what has some basis in reality. Socrates is not concerned with finding the right belief for other people as much as he is concerned with getting rid of false beliefs. And having false beliefs, like Euthyphro, gets Euthyphro into trouble accusing his own father of something that he doesn't understand. And having a false belief like Meletus gets him to look like a silly jackass, a silly fool who doesn't understand a thing. And so Socrates' defense in the Apology is not really about defending himself. It's about getting the Athenians to investigate themselves, to examine themselves. Socrates, to the end, investigates himself and other people by examining them. Okay, I know this is complicated. I've tried to compact and compress a lot into a relatively short time. We're just under 22 minutes. I'm going to post another assignment soon, but I wanted you to at least get the sense of what I was talking about in this first, and having you look at this first later charge. Have a good day.